Mississippi River, why America's $5 trillion waterway is guaranteed to fail. It's a $5 trillion bet balanced on aging concrete, and the river wants its money back. If this single hinge slips, America's export engine stalls, refineries scramble, and millions taste salt at the tap. Here's where things get interesting. One complex, the old river control structure, decides if the Mississippi stays put or jumps into the Atchafalaya. But hold on, because what I'm about to tell you next will completely change how you think about this. Drought is lowering the floor, floods are raising the ceiling, and every save stores more stress for the next hit. The question isn't whether control fails. Who knows it's guaranteed to fail, and why are they letting it happen? We tell ourselves the river is under control. Levees, locks, wing dams, dredging contracts. There's a system, schedules, manuals. Yet the system only works when the river cooperates, and the river's cooperation is getting shorter, thinner, meaner. At the center is a single point of failure we pretend is a solved problem: the old river control structure, or ORCS. Four major pieces, the low sill, auxiliary, overbank, and a hydro plant, are stitched into one promise: keep roughly 70% of the Mississippi in its current channel past Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and bleed 30% into the Atchafalaya. That split isn't a natural equilibrium. It's a negotiated armistice with a restless force that prefers the shorter, steeper Atchafalaya run to the Gulf. The lie works because most days barges still move. 2 or 3 feet of draft keep 60% or more of U.S. grain exports flowing to Gulf terminals. Petrochemicals roll out of Refinery Alley. Steel, fertilizer, coal, and aggregates shuttle along in predictable rhythms. Miss a window, you pay demurrage. Hit it, you make margins. But those margins are now as thin as the channel. The warning signs are stacked like driftwood after a crest. In 1973, the Mississippi nearly tore ORCS apart. Uplift pressures and scouring ate a football field-sized hole under 7 gates. The low sill structure survived, scarred for life, its capacity permanently reduced. The fix wasn't confidence, it was a patch. Add an auxiliary structure to share the load, lean on the overbank during extremes, pray the foundation holds. In 2011, the river ran high for months, and the margins again tightened more than headlines admitted. The Morganza spillway opened to take pressure. Crews watched the structures hum. Then the pendulum swung. In 2022, a flash drought collapsed river stages across the basin, and the lower Mississippi slid to record lows. Barges stacked up for miles. Drafts were cut repeatedly, every foot lost taking thousands of tons off each tow, multiplying into billions in lost capacity and higher freight rates. A year later, saltwater intrusion pushed a density wedge upstream toward municipal intakes as the river's flow fell below the threshold that keeps the Gulf out. It wasn't a one-off, it was a slow, cold verdict on a system optimized for yesterday's hydrograph. Here's the thing, control isn't a switch. It's a balancing act that gets harder with every engineered win. Wing dams, levees, and revetments pin the channel and accelerate flow in some reaches. That keeps navigation viable upstream but starves sediment downstream. Coastal deltaic land, Louisiana's natural buffer, shrinks as the river's mud shoots past or gets trapped where we'd rather it didn't. Subsidence lowers the playing field, while sea level and Gulf heat lift the baseline. The math isn't kind to fresh water or to the people who need it tomorrow morning. Meanwhile, ORCS is a busy toll booth. Every big flood slows the river as it meets the split, dumping more sediment. That sediment stacks like a long, invisible snowdrift, raising stage heights for the same flow. Floods today ride higher than floods of a generation ago, even when discharge is comparable. Each higher crest leans harder on the structure designed for a different century's normal. Each lower trough starves the channel, invites salt, and strands commerce. The system is whipsawing between ceilings and floors that move further apart. Industry can feel the teeth in the gears. A few inches lost in authorized channel depth sounds trivial until you scale it across a 15-barge tow. Light loading becomes routine, freight rates spike, storage bins fill because grain can't board a barge on time, basis blows out in the Midwest, while export bids in Louisiana remain firm. Farmers watch margins evaporate. Refiners adjust shifts and inventories to match delayed feedstock. Utilities taste brine in their intake lines and start drawing up backup plans. temporary intake barges, bottled water, reverse osmosis, long hoses over levees. Hospitals run salinity thresholds as if they were ICU vitals. There's a secondary ledger that never shows up in happy presses. Dredging costs balloon as deeper draft ambitions meet physics. The deeper you cut, the faster salt can slide in during low flow. Levee raises consume budgets meant for resilience, a word that tends to mean do the same thing bigger. FEMA funds clean up after the last crisis, while bond markets quietly start modeling the next one. Insurance underwriters, who don't care about political optics, price tail risk, prolonged closures, salinity disruptions, structural failures. Add exclusions here, hike premiums there. Municipal bonds tied to port throughput take watchlist notes. Too many days closed, too many emergency sills, not enough redundancy. And redundancy is the part no one wants to price honestly. This is a continental system with a single choke point. Yes, there are spillways and floodways. Yes, there are railroads and interstates. But when the river falters, those alternatives don't scale overnight. Rail crews and locomotives aren't spare parts in a warehouse. Interstate bridges have weight limits and bottlenecks. Trucking capacity is finite. Fuel and emissions add cost. Meanwhile, the marine crews live the pinch in steel bunk rooms, paid by the day while the queue grows, counting feet under keel in the dark. To understand why this isn't just a maintenance story, you follow the energy. Water wants the steeper path. The Atchafalaya offers a shorter, faster slide to the Gulf. Avulsions, the abrupt shift in a river's course, are the rule in geologic time, not the exception. We built ORCS to arrest an avulsion already in motion. We froze a river's vote at 70-30. Every flood, every drought is a new referendum on that mid-century ballot. So far, the result is not yet. Meanwhile, the promise of navigability days governs the economy like a metronome. A lock closure upstream isn't just a local headache. It's a drumbeat that echoes down to Baton Rouge and the grain terminals of the lower Mississippi. Petrochemical plants tuned to river supply don't switch to trucks without pain. LNG schedules and ship windows don't wait for shoals to be scraped away. A single shoal in the wrong bend can erase a week of export slots. Futures markets read the hiccup and translate it into volatility. Hedging costs flow back to consumers in quiet ways. A few cents here, a few dollars there. We also ignore the subsidy structure that props up the fiction of control. Dredging deepens channels for ships with drafts that push the limits, then salinity rides that depth inland when flow drops, provoking new emergency work. Levees squeeze the river, raising peaks in the name of safety, then demand more height as peaks rise. Each solution pushes the problem somewhere else or later in time. Those costs rarely land on the balance sheets of the shippers that benefit most. They land on taxpayers and future budgets. The most honest line in the room is this: the Mississippi physically wants the Atchafalaya. We pay year after year to say, not yet. We're good at it, astonishingly good, but we're buying time against rising odds. That's the guarantee baked into this story. It's not melodrama, it's mechanics. Think back to the near misses we treat like victories. In 2011, the river stayed where we needed it, but only after spillways opened and engineers ran daily depth surveys, watching for dangerous scour. The vibrations subsided, but the lesson didn't. In 2022 and 2023, there were no roaring crests, no scenic spillway shots, just quiet, relentless deficits. Barges grounded in places they shouldn't. The Wedge advanced in a slow, unseen layer. Utilities staged bottled water. The Corps built an underwater sill, basically a temporary sand dam to stall the salt. It worked, for a while. Fold in climate. Heavier bursts of rain feed higher crests, longer dry spells pull the bottom out. The Gulf is warmer, storm surge starts from a higher base. Subsidence continues, lowering the effective rim that protects fresh water. Stack these together and your structure, designed when variability was narrower, spends more time near its stress lines. Safety factors evaporate under compound events: low flow plus tropical moisture, high flow plus clogged sediment, heat waves plus power grid strain. Nothing fails until it does. And the market is already whispering the verdict. Underwriters tweak models. Investors ask how many days closed a port can absorb before a bond risks a downgrade. Farm lenders track basis blowouts and storage constraints, wondering which season tips borrowers into distress if barge slots vanish at the wrong time. It's not a headline crisis. It's a slow repricing of belief. So the problem isn't that we lack tools. It's that the tools were built for a river that's learning new tricks from us. We pinned it into a narrow path and took credit for predictability. Upstream, that delivered. Downstream, it stole sediment and elevated risk. We deepened the lower channel to chase larger ships. That sped salt under low flow. We treated drought like an occasional hiccup. It's now a scheduling reality. We funded after-the-fact fixes and called it resilience. The bill is growing. Get this, none of this requires a cinematic failure to hurt. A few more seasons like 2022-2023, and insurers will price salt risk into everything south of New Orleans. A few more flood years like 2019 and 2011, with higher stages for the same flow, and the maintenance window narrows to a sliver. A few more shoals in unlucky bends, and the export engine coughs in quarter turns, tinkering with global prices. It's death by 1,000 adjustments. Until your tap tastes wrong, your barge job pauses, or your grocery bill jumps, and one day the adjustment is too big. They didn't build ORCS to be immortal. They built it to buy time. The lie is thinking time is infinite. The truth is that every hour we buy now costs more than the last, and the river is getting a better lawyer. Night on the wheelhouse, the tug's spotlight skates along a levee wall and dies in the fog. He's reading the depth sounder like a pulse monitor, 8 feet under keel, then 7.5. The tow groans. He trims throttle, eases the rudder. One bad bend and 30,000 tons of corn and fertilizer could grind into a bar no one mapped yesterday. He taps the radio twice. No chatter, just current. He counts the seconds between beeps from the vibration alarm he installed himself. The river doesn't care who's on shift. It just asks who's paying attention. While he threads the channel, a farm kid in Illinois stares at a spreadsheet taped to the wall of a machine shed. Harvest's ready, but his barge slot slid 2 days. His dad says hold, basis is ugly if they dump to rail. The bins aren't empty from last year. Another storm skirts the county line and leaves dust. He calls the elevator, gets the same answer. We're waiting on the river. 2 cents here, 3 cents there. Small numbers that decide seed orders next spring. A combined payment, whether the hired man gets the extra week he was promised. Down near Plaquemines, a water plant operator lifts a plastic cup, swirls, and tastes a hint he never used to taste at his intake. It's not panic, it's planning time. The log sheet picks up new columns, chlorides, conductivity. When the wedge pushes past a line on a map, the call tree starts. Barges with temporary pumps get staged. Hoses snake over levees. He makes a note to call the school district. He knows exactly how long it takes to flush a system if the river keeps dropping. How many days before coffee tastes like the bay. On the river's Petrochemical mile, a shift supervisor watches a spreadsheet that looks nothing like the farm kids but feels the same. Feedstock is tight, export slots are unforgiving, and his unit hates idling. If the barge is late, he stretches inventories, begs a window from the dock scheduler, and scans corrosion reports. Salt in cooling water is a number with consequences. He can hear overtime creeping into the payroll, hear it in the way the crew jokes less when the yard radio crackles with another stand by for draft advisory. A deckhand wakes to the slap of a line, checks the queue with crusted eyes and does the math. 2 more days, maybe 3. He's got a newborn at home and a promise he'd be there next weekend. He sleeps in steel that sweats at night and bakes by noon. When the captain says, "We're light loading again," he doesn't think about economics. He thinks about hours, paid days versus missed days, and the sound of a hull scraping when the river drops faster than the rumor mill can track. Here's where it gets interesting. When the river chokes, grocery prices aren't a headline, they're a receipt. A chain buyer in St. Louis fields a call about vegetable oil deliveries. The plant downriver took its turn at maintenance early because intake numbers looked dicey. That pushes production 3 weeks. The buyer lifts the phone again. Can the rail spur help? Maybe, but the line's full of coal and containers. A truck can bridge the gap at a premium. The shelf looks fine. The cost hides in 10,000 carts. Meanwhile, a school nurse in Bellechasse checks a memo about mixing bottled with tap if conductivity spikes. She prints a flyer, tucks it into backpacks. Parents roll coolers into SUVs. The hospital down the road moves dialysis schedules an hour earlier to avoid the highest salinity window. A maintenance diver draws a circle on a photo of ORCS Today's eddy, tomorrow's risk, and drops into tea-brown water that pulls at his fins harder than last week. Routine checks turn careful. Careful turns into messages sent up the chain. Across town from a grain terminal, a merchandiser stares at basis charts as rain dodges counties like a game. He calls 6 farmers in a row and says the same thing. If we can't get the barge, hold if you can. If not, I'll find a rail car. He says it again to himself and knows rail can't swallow the river. He refreshes river gauges like sports scores, watches a line dip, and knows that line is perils 2 states away. The river narrows people's choices long before it breaks anything. It's the nurse's flyer, the farmer's bin, the pilot's inch under keel. It's breath held between beeps. It's a tug on a hose across a levee and a midnight call that says, "We are switching intakes now." To understand why the river narrows people's choices now, we need to go back to the moment the country decided to tame water with concrete and faith. In 1927, the Mississippi rose and kept rising until it drowned towns and futures from Cairo to the Gulf. Levees failed like zipper teeth popping open. More than 1 million people were displaced. Out of that trauma came a conviction: build higher, straighter, stronger. Control became a national religion, and the lower Mississippi got a new catechism: levees, floodways, and promises. That promise took shape in the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project. It wasn't just earth and steel, it was a worldview. Levees would confine the river, floodways would shunt the worst crests onto designated sacrificial ground, and navigation would enjoy a disciplined channel. The bargain worked, until you looked at what it cost downstream. Pin the river tight and you move the problem. You trade frequent smaller floods for rarer, more dangerous ones. You move mud out of the wetlands that need it and into places where it clogs and lifts stages. By the 1950s, another problem was growing teeth. The Atchafalaya, a shorter, steeper route to the Gulf, was grabbing more of the Mississippi's flow through the old river connection. Engineers saw the handwriting. If nothing changed, the main stem would jump west, and Baton Rouge and New Orleans would be left on a brackish backwater. That wasn't just a navigation problem, it was water, industry, and identity. So Congress drew a line: 70% down the Mississippi past the cities, 30% to the Atchafalaya, and the Army Corps built the old river control structure to enforce it. In 1963, ORCS came online, a low-sill gatehouse and overbank structure, later a navigation lock. It was an audacious idea: freeze a restless river's split into a fixed ratio and call it stability. For a while it held. Then 1973 arrived with a swollen basin, snowmelt stacked on persistent rains. The river pressed its case not with lawyers, but with uplift and scour. A wing wall collapsed. A deep eddy dug under 7 gates. The low sill survived, but it carried scars, its capacity cut, its confidence shaken. The quiet lesson landed: the boundary of control had revealed itself. What nobody knew at the time, or didn't say out loud, was how the river would learn from the hardware. Slow water at the control point, and you drop sediment there. Repeat it over decades, and flood heights for the same flow ratchet up. The fix for 73 was more structure, an auxiliary added in the 1980s to share stress, and later a hydro plant built to sip head and manage flows. Doctrine hardened too: restore to design intent, keep the ratio, open spillways when forced, close them when you can. The river answered louder with each decade of training. Meanwhile, the countryside changed to fit the river's promise. Grain belt mechanization and the Green Revolution scaled up yields and timed them to barge strings. Elevators rose like prairie cathedrals. Contracts leaned on predictable drafts and days. The ports below Baton Rouge became bulk export engines that could set global prices by the hour. Dependency wasn't an accident. It was a strategy built on a river held in place by decree. Every choice had an echo. Levees gave towns a sense of permanence, but they also perched the river higher above its floodplain, loading consequences into failures. Wing dams sharpened navigation but pushed sediment into fewer, deeper bars. Coastal marshes, cut off from replenishing mud, began to sink and fray. The Atchafalaya allowed its 30% built land and a vigorous delta. The lower Mississippi's bird's foot, starved and lengthened, became more fragile. By the time 2011 sent a long, punishing crest and forced the Morganza spillway open for only the second time, the playbook was familiar. Open gates here, close gates there, measure scour daily, watch the concrete hum. The structure worked to design, and the story looked like a triumph. But the hydrograph had shifted. Higher ceilings, lower floors, what once were rare events began to cluster. That's the context for today's gamble. ORCS didn't start a war with the river, it interrupted one that the river usually wins slowly. We trained water to behave for commerce and safety, then optimized a continent around that training. The river pushed back by changing where it dropped mud, how high it rode for a given flow, and how fast it could invite the Gulf upstream when discharge faltered. The history isn't a museum exhibit. It's the ground we're standing on while the stakes rise. ports, pipelines, and the petrochemical belt. From Baton Rouge down past Plaquemines, the river becomes a factory floor. Bulk terminals line the banks, grain loaders, coal conveyors, steel scrap yards, while refineries and chemical plants sit behind them like stadiums with permanent smoke. Timing decides everything here. A ship window missed by 4 hours isn't a shrug, it's a domino that knocks through an entire week of cargoes. Lower Mississippi ports are built to eat volume. Grain from the Midwest arrives in tows, gets flipped into ocean vessels on tight lakens, and sets global prices by the timing of a draft and a tide. LNG carriers stack schedules in synchronized minutes. Ammonia, methanol, and polymers move from tanks to ships with pipeline precision. Each unit relies on the river's stage, behaving within a narrow band, and every inch outside that band multiplies into cost. Refinery Alley lives on that band. Feedstock rides barges and pipelines keyed to a hydraulic grade that assumes the Mississippi will hold backbone flow. When stages drop, drafts bite, and lightering barges show up with calculators. When stages rise and stay high, dock access goes to safety minimums and terminals clamp down on movements. A shift supervisor can feel the river in a console's alarms. Cooling water salinity flirting with thresholds, dock mooring, loads creeping, pump curves sliding out of spec. This is where pipelines meet physics. Lines were designed on the assumption that head differences and gravity assists would look like the past. A capture or even a prolonged low-flow regime changes the energy landscape. Pumps re-rate, reversals that pencil on paper stall against reality. A pipeline that once delivered with a comfortable margin now drags because the river's hydraulic support isn't where it was. Valves that sat in sweet spots get noisy. Operators burn more electricity to move the same barrel. Meanwhile, the grain elevator manager watches the board and listens to the river like weather. He knows a shoal upriver can vaporize a week of ship windows downstream. Unknown to them, across town, a seemingly minor bar forms on a bend. Pilots agree to shave drafts a foot for safety. 3 ultra-large bulkers waiting at anchor suddenly don't fit their booked load plans. The elevator recalculates, splits cargoes, and calls the merchandiser. We can lift 2/3 now and top off later if the dredge clears the bar. That later becomes a week, the ship pays to wait, and the basis reflects pain. Global markets amplify local glitches. Freight futures read the draft advisories and price risk. A rumor that the window at Southwest Pass tightened by 6 hours in a low-flow week puts a premium on vessels already on the hook. Hedges widen bands. Fuel buyers hedge more diesel for tugs. Insurance adds a surcharge for port stays that exceed normal variance. None of it is dramatic. All of it lands on people's bills. Inside the plants, maintenance schedules slip into defensive driving. A unit that was supposed to go down in October goes down in August because cooling water risks are climbing. A contractor workforce arrives early, hotels fill, and a town's weekend shifts change because the river said so through a conductivity meter. Over the fence, a plastics plant shifts to rail for a sliver of output, discovers the yard can't handle the surge, and waits for loaded cars that sit 2 miles away behind a coal string that also can't move without the river cooperating. Pilots feel the squeeze in their notebooks. They stack tide, wind, and draft in columns and circle the one variable nobody can fix on the fly, channel depth at the bar that formed yesterday. They gamble a pass, time it to a tide, and commit. There's no second try if the keel kisses sand. A safe transit preserves a week of exports. A grounding chews up days. The anxiety bleeds into scheduling meetings nobody sees. Unknown to them, across town at a port authority office, a bond analyst dials in. Throughput guarantees underpin debt, and the slide deck has a new line item. Days closed due to low water, days reduced by high water, emergency sills built and raised. The analyst asks how many drafts days above 47 feet the port can maintain, how many below 40 feet it can survive. The CFO says they're building redundancy. The river says it wants a say. Pipelines join that meeting in silence. The Atchafalaya's pull increases in flood years, the Mississippi's push weakens in drought. A capture reorders head and flow paths. Pumps that depended on a certain back pressure face a new normal. A line to a dock that sits on a reach that loses stage needs capital, not a memo. The reroute isn't a weld, it's years. Here's the thread tying it all. LNG, ammonia, grain, steel, crude, and chemicals share one metronome. When the river narrows that rhythm, the petrochemical belt turns inward, ports shuffle and pipelines hum harder. Tweaks ripple outward to freight, to food prices, to global spreads, because one valley's physics wrote the schedule, and the river keeps editing it in real time. The insurance and finance trigger. While dock crews watch drafts, a quieter clock starts ticking in offices with no windows on the river. Underwriters refresh models and ask dull questions that move billions. What if the wedge lasts 90 days instead of 30? How many days closed before a port's debt coverage ratio wobbles? What happens to a refinery's cooling systems if chloride spikes 5 times in a season? They don't need sirens to make changes. They need trend lines. Models now carry 3 tails: capture at old river, levee or floodway failures that force prolonged closures, and salinity intrusions that shut municipal intakes and trip industrial thresholds. The first is low probability, high severity. The second is becoming more frequent. The third is already operational. Reinsurers, who back the insurers, hate clusters. 2 drought years in a row looks like a cluster, not a blip. Premiums step up, deductibles stretch, exclusions multiply in the fine print. A Port Authority CFO flips to a slide labeled throughput risk. Bond covenants assume a baseline of open days. Add 10 more days closed and the coverage cushion thins. Add 20 and watch lists appear. The debt markets don't yell, they demand more interest quietly. A banker says, show me redundancy, alternate intakes, stockpile dredge funds, contingency contracts. The port promises studies. The rating committee marks outlook negative if the answers are vague. Farm credit officers sit across from producers and look past this harvest. Storage filled last season when barge slots vanished. Carry costs bit, basis blew out. If it happens again, operating lines stretch then fray. They ask about bins, hedges, rail access, and debt service. It sounds personal, but it's systemic. River risk moving into the cost of money. A weak barge year can now echo through seed purchases and equipment notes a season later. This decision would haunt them shows up as a line item. Deferred resilience projects, intake extensions, cross-parish water ties, backup pumps, higher freeboards were cheaper 5 years ago. Now they cost more and lenders price the delay. A bond prospectus notes planned capital for water security. If it's unfunded, the cost of capital rises to match the hazard. If it's funded, the rate still reflects the river's new variance. Either way, the market loads the dice. Reinsurers send signals first. A European firm trims Gulf exposure on industrial interruption tied to navigation days. Another adds a parameter. Salinity-induced business interruption is no longer bundled with storm surge. It's its own peril with its own deductible. A third requires clients to maintain a minimum of alternative intake capacity to keep coverage. None of this is a press conference. It's an email that changes a budget. Municipal water systems feel it fastest. A parish renews its property and casualty policy and finds a new exclusion. Corrosion from chloride over threshold is not covered unless mitigation assets are in place. The board meets, balks at the premium, then looks at the map of the wedge's last push. A bond advisor clears her throat and says, rates up now or far more later. Ratepayers pay either way, the only question is when. Unknown to them, across town, a private equity team screens a midstream deal on the lower Mississippi. The model used to assume navigation days as a constant. Now the diligence packet includes a heat map of draft restrictions by month, a curve for emergency dredge availability, and a scenario where ORCS is offline for 30 days due to a near miss. The discount rate fattened by 50 basis points quietly kills the deal. The seller hears market conditions. Insurers like metrics they can price. Days closed, draft days below X feet, salinity miles upstream, and emergency sill height become KPIs. A port that reports them transparently and shows a plan gets a slightly better rate. A parish that waits for the Corps to build a sill each time pays more. A plant that hardens intakes and keeps a barge-mounted pump on lease gets a credit. Adaptation becomes an underwriting checklist. Hedge funds watch river gauges like weather traders. A low-flow forecast in the Ohio becomes a basis play on Gulf grain. A rising salinity profile near Violet whispers about refinery margins. They don't insure, they arbitrage, but their moves inform the banks who do. Volatility in freight futures bleeds into lender risk premiums. Shipping lines bake delays into charters. The invisible hand adds a surcharge for physics. Fintech creeps into the gap. Parametric insurance, payouts on triggers, not damage, appears for ports. If draft at a control point drops below Y feet for Z days, a check lands. Payouts fund dredging or offset demurrage. Premiums aren't cheap, but they beat balance sheet bleeding. A city considers a parametric for chloride. If conductance over threshold persists X days, funds unlock for trucking water and filters. Actuaries smile at triggers. Politicians squirm at the optics of paying for what used to be normal. In the background, the Mississippi River and tributaries budget fights look different. Supplemental appropriations after each event get harder to sell when rating agencies recite the sequence. Markets want predictability. The river offers conditions. The trigger isn't catastrophe, it's repricing. The guarantee that the river wants the Atchafalaya turns into the guarantee that money gets more expensive first. And when money moves, everything else follows. Climate acceleration, higher ceilings, lower floors. 3 days earlier, a minor tropical storm drifted toward the delta while gauges upriver read like a drought report. Not a hurricane, not a headline maker, just enough surge and rain in the wrong sequence. The timing turned routine operations into triage. A city shifted intakes an hour early. A refinery tightened cooling water limits. A pilot bumped a transit to catch a narrow tide. Nothing failed. Everything ran closer to the line. Heavier rain bursts now stack crests faster. In the Ohio and Missouri basins, storms dump in tight windows, pushing sudden rises into channels trained for steadier climbs. The hydrograph spikes, shorter ramp up higher top. Those bursts carry sediment loads that slam into constrictions, forcing velocity to choke and scouring where you least want it. What used to be a week-long rise arrives in days, and the system burns through its safe maneuvers quicker than the paperwork can catch up. Then the other side shows. Longer dry spells widen the troughs. Weeks turn to months with too little discharge to hold the Gulf at bay. Flow settles well below the 300,000 CFS comfort line, and the salt layer slides upriver with less resistance, filling holes like a slow fog at the bottom of the channel. Barges carry less, intakes taste more, and the underwater sill that bought a month last time buys 2 weeks now because the Wedge has learned the deeper path we dug for ships. A warmer Gulf lifts the baseline. Surge events begin from a higher platform, and the density contrast at the mouth stiffens the Wedge. The salt layer becomes more stubborn, harder to thin, and quicker to reform after a small rise passes. Meanwhile, sea level rise plus subsidence lowers the table the freshwater sits on. The river doesn't need to fall as far for the Wedge to reach critical infrastructure. The map of risk expands without the lines moving. Design standards lag reality. The structures and levees were calibrated to histories that smoothed the extremes. Safety factors assumed independence of events, one variable high while others stayed near normal. Compound events erase those assumptions. Low flow meets a coastal surge and a brief thunderstorm squall line, and the result is a brackish push. At the same moment, dredgers are committed to keep the navigation window open. High flow meets a sediment choke, and uplift pressures climb while operators juggle gates that haven't cycled in months. The spreadsheet says redundancy, the river says simultaneity. On the flood side, higher ceilings are more than stage numbers. They're energy. Each additional foot of river against concrete multiplies force on foundations and increases the head across the 70-30 split. The Atchafalaya's pull grows in those moments, carving deeper in its bed and boosting the next flood's attraction. Operators watch vibrations and pore pressures with the memory of 1973 in their ears, knowing a millimeter in the wrong place can turn readings into alarms. On the drought side, lower floors cut into the economy in quiet, relentless ways. Draft advisories become the lingua franca of a season. A pilot's rule of thumb, 1 inch less draft equals hundreds of tons lost, turns into a daily loss ledger. Light loading becomes standard, lightering becomes a business model, and freight rates bake in climate variance as a permanent surcharge. Farmers adjust planting decisions to hedge against storage and river risk, not just price. Refineries rewrite maintenance windows to dodge salinity hours like storms on a radar. What nobody knew at the time was how quickly these shifts would compress maintenance. Windows that used to open for months now crack for weeks, or not at all. The off-season becomes a myth told by schedules that keep slipping. Critical inspections get squeezed, and parts backlogs meet urgency. You can't pour concrete fixes in flood, and you can't dredge everywhere in drought. So you triage, and the river notices. Meanwhile, the salt wedge's return time shortens. Once-a-decade episodes creep toward every few years. Utilities build muscle memory, barge pumps staged, blending protocols rehearsed, but each activation costs. Chloride eats budgets as well as pipes. Insurance notices repeated triggers and prices them as norms. Parishes that never expected to coordinate crossed eyes suddenly share valves and politics because the plume doesn't respect boundaries. Everything was about to change when a storm brushed the bird's foot during a low-flow week. Surge nudged the wedge while wind stacked water at the mouth. Upstream, no relief. The sill held barely after a rapid raise that forced dredges to reshuffle cuts upriver. Ports lost a day and then another half. Hospitals moved dialysis hours earlier for 3 days running. A school district cancelled sports to save bottled water for classrooms. On paper, it was a near miss. On the ground, it was a rehearsal. In the aftermath, design intent looked dated. Freeboards felt thin. Intake elevations that once seemed safe now lived inside the salt map for too many days a year. The Corps scheduled more frequent surveys, cities budgeted for permanent auxiliary intakes, ports stockpiled dredge agreements like spare parts. The language shifted from unprecedented to recurring. The ceiling had climbed, the floor had dropped. The space between held the country's commerce, and the margin inside that space kept shrinking. Alternatives that aren't. Diversions, rails, and fantasy fixes. First idea sounds decisive. Accept capture and move with it. If the Mississippi wants the Atchafalaya, let it go. On maps in quiet rooms, planners sketch a migration, ports shift toward Morgan City and Berwick Bay, pipelines regrade to new docks, refineries replumb for different heads, ship channels cut through different mud. It reads like a clean pivot. On the ground, it's a decade-plus upheaval measured in rights-of-way, permits, litigation, and sunk capital that still has bonds to pay. You can't uproot Refinery Alley with a memo. You can't build a deep draft complex in a swamp faster than wetlands law and geotechnics allow. Meanwhile, the old ports still have to run. Then come mega diversions, the seduction of fixing two problems with one concrete mouth. Open the river to the wetlands, rebuild land, and lower flood stages. In a perfect world, you swing wide gates, route sediment into dying marsh, and keep a 50-foot navigation channel trimmed for ships. Here's the rub. What builds land often steals depth. Mud wants to drop where water slows, exactly the opposite of what a ship channel needs. Diversions strong enough to matter can sabotage drafts at the wrong times. You can phase them, aim them, and schedule them, but every cubic yard that settles out of the navigation corridor is a yard you don't dredge later, or a yard you definitely do for a price. Rail and truck look like cavalry until you count wheels and crews. The grain belt already leans on Class I railroads that juggle coal, intermodal, autos, and chemicals. Add a sudden barge shortfall and yards jam. Locomotives aren't idle assets, engineers don't materialize, and sidings don't lengthen on command. Trucks fill the gaps in headlines, but bridges choke, diesel spikes, and 1,040-ton fixes can't substitute for a single 40,000-ton tow. Emissions climb, wear spreads, and rural roads designed for harvest pulses, not sustained freight migration, break under the load. You can move some volume for a season. You can't replace the river's economics with asphalt. So the conversation drifts to canals and backdoors. Could the Yazoo backwater route be widened into a failover? Could the intracoastal become a true parallel? Physics still rules. The Yazoo Delta is flat, water creeps, it doesn't sprint. The intracoastal is a workhorse for tugs and barges, but it isn't a deep draft freeway waiting for bulkers. Cut a new channel and you inherit the same sediment arithmetic. Slow water, drop load, repeat. Every shortcut becomes a maintenance plan with an accent. Here's the thing, redundancy takes time we haven't put on calendars. Staged resilience sounds smart. Build auxiliary intakes now, crosstie parishes, preposition barge-mounted pumps, stockpile rock for emergency sills, harden a few upland railheads with grain and fuel capacity, and set up lightering fleets to keep ship windows alive when drafts pinch. All of that buys seasons, not eras. It doesn't solve capture physics. It doesn't erase whiplash droughts. It just stretches the timeline between crises, so decisions can be made on weekdays instead of midnights. Fantasy fixes sneak in as language. Just dredge more ignores that deeper channels ease salt inland during drought. Just raise levees forgets that higher walls perch the river and lift consequences. Just desalinate pretends municipal budgets can drink $1 billion plant built for rare events, then idle it forever. Just reroute pipelines skips the years of permitting and the reality that pumps don't like their energy maps rewritten. Just move the ports sounds brave until a single berth takes a decade and a city to host it. There are practical steps that don't sell themselves with ribbon cuttings. Pay for measurement, more gauges, more salinity profiles, better bathymetry near the hinge points, so operators move from hunch to data. Fund parametric triggers that release money the day draft drops or chloride rises, so local leaders aren't begging for appropriations while the wedge is under their dock. Write honest metrics into bond disclosures, days closed, draft days, salinity miles. You can't manage what you refuse to count. Meanwhile, accept trade-offs in the open. Megadiversions that build land will sometimes narrow drafts. Plan export schedules around windows you can protect, and stop pretending you can maximize both every week of the year. Rail needs crew pipelines and yard capacity years in advance. Pay for them before you need them. Truck corridors need designated surge routes and bridge upgrades. Pick them now, not during a queue. Hardening intakes costs less today than paying insurers a premium for the same risk tomorrow. Pay off every path delays. None erases the guarantee. The river's intent doesn't vanish because spreadsheets got prettier. What changes is who gets breathing room and who does. Staged redundancy, done honestly, buys time for a managed retreat where it makes sense, a strategic fortification where it must, and fewer panicked weeks where hoses cross levees in the dark. It's not a cure. It's a choice to land softer when physics calls in our debts. The people on the line, micro stories. The levee cook wipes steam off a griddle and checks a clipboard covered in river stages. He used to plan orders by headcount. Now he plans by queues. When barges stack 2 miles long, breakfast shifts double. Bacon goes first, then coffee, then patience. He counts tips like fuel, thin on flood weeks, thinner on drought. His daughter needs new cleats. He marks the stage at Baton Rouge and circles Saturday. If the draft advisory tightens, that circle turns into a double. A Plaquemines teacher keeps a tote in the trunk, jugs, lids, a roll of tape. In August, she sent home a flyer about taste and conductivity. In September, she told kids to bring water bottles. In October, she set a timer to fill tubs before the wedge might roll past the intake. She runs a lesson on estuaries and doesn't mention her own sink. When the robocall says, blending today, she switches to dry erase markers because the cheap ones smear with brackish film. A grain merchandiser in Davenport watches storms dodge counties like they've got a grudge. He has 6 farmers on hold and a spreadsheet that says no cars in bold. The river gauge dips another 1/10. He tells one farmer to hold if the bin's safe, tells another to ship to a smaller elevator with an open pit, and buys an expensive rail slot he swore he wouldn't. His bonus used to ride freight rates. Now it rides draft days. A maintenance diver straps on a tank and studies a laminated photo of the low sill. He circles the eddy he felt last time with a grease pencil. Visibility down there is an arm's length on a good day, a hand on a bad one. He counts kicks, listens for the pitch change in flow, and reaches for a seam he knows by touch. The silt moves like breath. He pats the concrete, finds his way back, and taps a signal line twice. Routine becomes careful. Careful becomes a text to his supervisor, feels different. A harbor pilot sits on a stool by a window, flipping through tide tables with a pencil stuck behind his ear. He's got a bulk carrier that needs a foot more than the advisory says is smart. He stacks wind, tide, and a cut he ran yesterday when the sandbar was smaller. He takes the job, times the pass, and tells the bridge, once we line up, we don't stop. The ship clears by inches nobody will ever applaud. He goes home, writes a note in a notebook, bar grew again. The levee cook gets a call from his wife, daycare raised rates. He adds toast to the breakfast plate unasked. He used to joke with deckhands about the river's moods. This year, it's all quiet math. 2 more days of queues, 3 more pallets of eggs, then maybe a lull. If the wedge pushes up again, the hospital will order lunches on short notice, and his Saturday off will evaporate. He smiles anyway because deckhands tip when they haven't slept. From their perspective, every foot of water is a paycheck or a pink slip. The teacher budgets bottled water like supplies. The merchandiser's voice changes when the gauge drops. The diver feels the river through his gloves long before headlines. The pilot gambles for safe margins with a watch, not a roulette wheel. The cook ties family plans to a hydrograph line. Unknown to them, across town, a dialysis nurse moves appointments 30 minutes earlier to dodge salinity peaks. She tapes a note to a machine, check chloride, log every hour. A refinery lab tech switches vials faster when the number creeps toward threshold. He texts his partner he'll be late again. In a parish office, a clerk fields questions about taste and bills from people who don't care about CFS, just coffee. A farmer loads a truck at dusk, not dawn, because the elevator opened a surprise night shift to catch a barge window. His kid sits on the tailgate, kicking boots against the bumper, asking if Halloween will move this year. He says no, then thinks about it and says, "We'll make it work." He means the costume, he means the year. Meanwhile, a deckhand finally gets cell service. He scrolls baby photos, zooms too far and laughs alone. The tow idles. He hears the captain say, "We'll try at first light." He tucks the phone in his pocket, pulls on gloves and grabs the line. The river doesn't care, they do. The political theater and the quiet truths. While the river wrote deadlines in sand and concrete, the podiums wrote a different story. Ribbon cuttings framed new dredges against the skyline. Officials praised emergency sills like moon landings. A line of microphones, a hard hat, a handshake, then a sentence that sounded like certainty. The optics were clean, we were on top of it. The quiet part, how often we'd need those same emergencies, stayed off the stage. Jurisdiction turned into a maze with no map. Federal levee districts overlapped with state coastal agencies. Parishes owned intakes, ports ran docks, private plants managed process water. Each controlled a piece, none controlled outcomes. A parish president demanded faster sills. A port director asked for deeper channels. A coastal scientist asked for diversions that would drop sediment. They were all right and all at odds. Litigation hung over every decision like a summer storm. If taps salted out, who paid? The parish that ran the intake, the corps that built the sill, the port authority that pushed for dredging. If cargo stalled, did contracts excuse performance or trigger penalties? Lawyers wrote contingency clauses as fast as engineers wrote gate schedules. Nobody wanted to be the defendant in the case that set precedent. Budget cycles wrote their own logic. Annual appropriations rewarded near-term wins, visible, fast, and countable. Multi-decade risk needed quiet spending on surveys, cross-ties, and spare parts nobody would notice. A new dredge earned a press release. A sensor network did not. An emergency barge train of drinking water earned headlines. A redundant intake upstream earned a footnote. The incentives leaned toward the next photo, not the next decade. Meanwhile, a hearing room filled with engineers who kept saying design intent. Restore what was drawn, hold the ratio, keep draft. It sounded responsible. It also sounded like the river wasn't changing. A coastal advocate cleared her throat and said the bird's foot was starving while the Atchafalaya built land. The chair thanked her and asked the corps about the sill height. The transcript read busy, the river read louder. What nobody said out loud showed up in choices. Protecting throughput now, deeper channels, faster cuts, could worsen low-flow salinity later. A port director knew it. A water utility manager knew it. They avoided eye contact in the same meeting because both needed the river for different reasons. The compromise lived in the schedule, dredge hard in windows that spared the worst salt pushes and hoped the weather cooperated. While that was happening in Baton Rouge, a parish council voted to issue bonds for intake improvements and asked the state for matching funds. Unknown to them, across town, a coastal program sliced a diversion budget line to keep a levee raise on schedule. Each action made sense inside its lane. Inside the basin, they cancelled out. The river enjoys those contradictions. Politics feeds them. A congressman toured the Atchafalaya Basin, called it a treasure, and promised support for both wetlands and navigation. A day later, he stood in front of a grain loader downriver and promised faster dredging. He wasn't lying. He was stacking incompatible truths and leaving the corps to referee physics with annual dollars and timeless judgments. The agency took the heat and the homework. Emergency management polished muscle memory, build sill, truck water, reposition dredges, coordinate pilots, file for aid. The after-action reports praised teamwork and recommended more of the same. The quiet truth crept between the lines. These were rehearsals, not one-offs. The Wedge came back. The drought came back. The floods came back. Each return made the emergency look like policy. A state legislator floated a bill to require days closed, reporting from every port and intake. Industry lobbyists frowned, then softened. Transparency hurt in the short term and helped with underwriting in the long term. The bill stalled in committee. A bond analyst reading the hearing transcript marked data limited and added 10 basis points to a model. No one cut a ribbon for that. In a back room, port and parish staff drafted a joint letter, aligned dredging windows with low-flow forecasts, pre-stage rock for sills, co-fund upstream intake barges. They knew cooperation beat theater. They also knew the cameras would come when the Wedge reached a school's tap, not when a procurement officer sourced valves early. They filed the letter anyway and waited for a meeting no one would televise. The transition came in whispers. A port added salinity miles to dashboards. A parish published draft days on its website. A state budget line included parametric triggers for river risk. None of it stopped the physics. It did start to align calendars with gauges. If we couldn't agree on the problem in speeches, the river would pick the answer in stages. The theater would go on. The quiet truth would set the bill. The inevitable near miss, a composite crisis. Low-flow summer bled into September when a weak Gulf storm slid north. Surge nudged the mouth while the river sagged. The salt wedge thickened and crept. The core rushed rock to raise the sill near Violet as conductivity screens ticked upward. Utility directors switched to barge intakes. Across town, a refinery hot-idled a unit and posted overtime. Unknown to them, a shoal upriver shaved drafts below Baton Rouge. 3 ultra-large bulkers missed Lakens. A week of exports scattered. Pilots, watching a tricky bend grow, cut another foot for safety. Dredges split shifts, 1 crew on the sill, 1 crew on the bar. Every move stole capacity from somewhere else. At Old River, vibration alarms spiked. Operators feathered the low sill and shut auxiliary bays in sequence. The Morganza playbook opened, then closed. Open and you flood small towns. Hold and the hum gets mean. A maintenance diver felt the pitch change in the current and surfaced early. He didn't like the seam. Hospitals moved dialysis blocks to mornings. Schools picked up bottled water. Tow captains idled in mile-long strings, calculators out. Markets repriced drafts and demurrage in hours. Nothing failed. It felt broken anyway. When rain finally arrived, the Wedge retreated, the alarms settled, and the ledger kept the charge. Next time, less margin. The decision that isn't a decision. In the debrief room after the near miss, the whiteboard fills with 2 columns that pretend to be choices. Keep the 70-30 split at all costs, or negotiate with capture in stages. The first path is familiar. Hold the hinge, defend the ports, buy more rock, more dredging, more monitoring, more drills. The second path sounds like surrender until you read it as triage. Decide which assets move, which systems cross-tie, which jobs migrate with the water, and which don't. Maps come out that no one wants photographed. A strategic retreat map doesn't show failure, it shows sequencing. Which berths could replicate at Berwick Bay sooner than anyone admits. Which pipelines could regrade toward the Atchafalaya's new head with pump stations pre-built, even if they sit idle for years. Which towns can replumb to higher, cleaner intakes and share them across parish lines. Which fields shift to crops that don't depend on barge timing to survive a late harvest. Finance enters the room like gravity. Ports have bonds, plants have capital plans, parishes have ratepayers. The pivot won't write itself. You layer financing stacks, federal grants for redundancy, state bonds for water security, port authority debt backed by throughput floors that assume disruption, carbon market dollars for land building diversions that double as risk reduction, private capital that funds lightering fleets and barge-mounted pumps because they can generate revenue now. You set triggers. Money unlocks when draft days fall below a target or when salinity miles cross a line for too many days in a season. Here's where it gets interesting. Redundancy isn't a slogan, it's a schedule. Stage it like scaffolding. Year 1, harden intakes, pre-stage portable pumps, stand-up parametric insurance that pays on days closed, and place rock stockpiles where sills rise fastest. Year 3, build cross-parish tie lines, add a permanent auxiliary intake upstream for the largest systems, and certify lightering capacity to keep ship windows open when drafts pinch. Year 5, re-rate critical pipelines for changed heads, construct one new deep draft berth west of the hinge as a pilot, and move a sliver of grain elevation capacity to an upland railhead with real yard space. Years, not decades. Breathing room, not salvation. The metrics have to be honest or none of it matters. Days closed, draft days by foot, salinity miles upstream, emergency sill height on the day it was needed, not on the day it was funded. These are not optics, they are the metronome that tells lenders, insurers, and the public what the river is actually doing. If the dashboards show the truth, capital prices reality instead of rumor. If they don't, the repricing arrives anyway, with penalties. Unknown to them, across town, a port board chair and a parish utility director are learning to share calendar. Dredging windows must avoid the worst low-flow months if you don't want to roll out bottled water again. Intake upgrades must finish before the next planned channel deepening if you want to keep trust. The trade-off doesn't disappear, it just becomes explicit. Protect throughput where it makes sense. Protect drinking water where it must. Admit when those goals collide. The debate over diversions gets sharper and more useful. A land building gate strong enough to matter will tighten drafts at times. So you schedule exports around the pulses, you can protect and stop pretending you can maximize both every week. The payoff is coastal ground that buys levees time, even as ships accept a more variable rhythm. Frames shift from either or to which week and who pays. And there's the quiet third column on the whiteboard, what not to do. Don't bet the farm on a single mega fix that needs a decade of permits and a century of luck. Don't deepen blindly without paying the salinity tab in advance. Intakes raised, cross ties finished, sill rock already staged, not promised. Don't publish victory speeches around emergencies. Publish maintenance schedules and keep them. People on the line are part of the plan or the plan fails. Harbor pilots want clearer draft triggers, give them the thresholds and stick to them. Tow operators want certainty on lightering capacity, fund it and contract it in peacetime. Teachers want reliable guidance on water safety, build communication protocols around conductivity, not rumor. Divers want inspection windows that actually align with flow forecasts, put them in the calendar first, not last. The hard part isn't the engineering. It's admitting that both paths, hold the hinge and stage the pivot, cost money and political capital at the same time. The decision that isn't a decision is this: stop choosing between today and tomorrow. Do the work that keeps the lights on while quietly moving the plugs for when they can't be kept on here. It's not elegant, it's durable. Here's the last turn. The river will force an answer eventually. The question is whether those answers arrive in a scramble, with hoses over levees and lawyers over contracts, or on weekdays, with budgets that anticipated physics and people who knew where to stand when the water shifted. The hinge can hold for a while longer. Use that while wisely. Measure what matters. Build the backups. Move the pieces that can move without breaking the ones that can't. Decide by doing. We trained a river to behave, then forgot it never agreed to the rules. If you want the untold map of what moves, what dies, and what survives when the river chooses, watch the next deep dive on America's hidden retreat lines. Subscribe now so you don't miss the chapter's decision makers hope you never see.